Good morning, everyone. My name is Robert Karanja, Senior Director at Co-Develop. Co-Develop is an international nonprofit that works with governments around the world to fast-track the adoption of digital public infrastructure. And how do we do this? We do this by making investments in 4 broad buckets. These buckets include making investments in technical assistance, so in technical assistance providers who can work directly with governments as they design and work around their architecture for their digital public infrastructure. We also make investments in digital public goods, and these are DPGs that are working directly with countries to digitize. It could be instant payments, it could be the digitization of civil records. So we make a substantial chunk of our investments, at least 40% of our investments, go into digital public goods. The third bucket that we make investments in is around research and working with research institutions, consultants who are carrying out innovative research in digital public infrastructure. And that's also an important area of our work, so that we are continuously producing knowledge around digital public infrastructure. And then finally, Co-Develop also makes investments in civil society or inclusion and safety, supporting civil society organizations who are working around inclusion and safety, and also we've also made investments in the UN safeguards around safe and inclusive digital public infrastructure to ensure that as countries are rolling out DPI, they're also thinking about the inclusion and safety side of things. So in summary, that's what we do. I'm responsible for our Africa partnerships and strategic investments, and have been working on the continent for about 20 years now. And I'm seeing a lot of innovation happening around how African countries are thinking through digital transformation and transitioning their digital transformation into society scale digital public infrastructure, and working closely with governments in East Africa, so Uganda, Tanzania, governments such as Zambia, South Africa. In West Africa, we're working with Ghana, Nigeria, Gambia, and others to advance and fast track the adoption of digital public infrastructure on the continent. And that takes me to my first question. What does successful deployment look like generally from an African perspective? DPI is still a relatively new concept. India did a fantastic job of showing the world what is possible through population scale digital public infrastructure. India made significant investments in Aadhaar, the digital ID system, and also in UPI, which is an instant payment system that has included and brought into inclusion hundreds of millions of Indians, and also advanced numbers around financial inclusion in the ecosystem. And so many countries are now looking at digital public infrastructure as a way of really advancing their economies and also including more people, in their countries, and using DPI to really fast track how government works with people, and how people can also relate to government, and how the public sector and the private sector can work together to advance initiatives around digitization. And so I think what's unique about the African situation is that digitization is not new to Africa. Digitization has been taking place on the continent for many years, and we have significant projects that have advanced financial inclusion, payments, and even ID on the continent for many years. And I think that the fact that digitization has been taking place for so long, I feel that deployment of digital public infrastructure on the continent as successfully in Africa should not look at rebuilding these systems, but should look at how can we restructure these systems so that they're open, they're accessible, they become foundational, and both the public and private sector can build upon these rails to provide services and essential services to people. And I'll just give an example. M-Pesa is a revolution in Kenya and in East Africa in terms of payments, and has really advanced the financial inclusion numbers in Kenya, because millions of people who were previously unbanked can now participate in the economy, are able to make relatively small payments. The volumes have increased, money can move from mobile wallets to bank wallets and vice versa. And also payments can be made to government, to merchants, and in so many different directions. But M-Pesa still remains a closed system. But if we're looking at, for example, transforming M-Pesa into digital public infrastructure, then both the public and the private sector would need to work together to see how that can be opened up as an open platform system, make it interoperable, and then invite other players to be able to plug into M-Pesa and build upon M-Pesa, and essentially transform the way M-Pesa works to even not only greater financial inclusion, but also access to millions of Kenyans and millions of Africans. And so that's just an example that I can give in terms of what deployment should look like from an African perspective. If you look at countries such as Kenya, we've built an amazing government services hub portal called eCitizen that enables citizens to engage with government and make payments and also apply for government services. Zambia has also built an amazing citizen portal hub. Uganda has UG Hub. So digitization has been taking place on this continent, and we cannot ignore that fact. And the thing is that how do we transition this to digital public infrastructure? Can we make it interoperable? Can we have it as a foundational layer? And can it be open to enable both the public and the private sector to build upon these rails? And I think that's what makes digital public infrastructure unique from an African perspective. So I'll just take on the second question. The second question is, what kind of funding system is needed to enable DPI at scale globally? That's an interesting question because up until this point, DPI has primarily been funded by philanthropic funding. Funders such as the Gates Foundation, Rockefeller, Nandan Nilekani, and others have really taken it upon themselves to fund digital public infrastructure around the world. And I think it's important for these philanthropic funders to have catalyzed investments in digital public infrastructure. But I think to take this to the next level, not only do we need additional funders to come into this space, but I think it would also make plenty of business sense for multilateral funders such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, to also come into this space and really start seeing how they can make investments that can fast track the adoption of digital public infrastructure in countries that they work with. They're able to scale up funding. The multilaterals are also able to provide funding at unprecedented levels that will enable digital public infrastructure to grow beyond what the philanthropic funders can do. And I think that would really be a game changer for the funding ecosystem around digital public infrastructure. So that's one recommendation that I would make. But I believe the work that the philanthropic funders has done to date has really helped not only generate knowledge and interest in digital public infrastructure, but has also catalyzed funding from other funders and the interest of other funders. And I think it would get to an amazing point if multilateral funders could also come into this space and start funding digital public infrastructure to scale it globally. And I'll just take on the third question. What unique considerations need to be prioritized when working on DPI in Africa? This is an interesting question because I feel DPI should never be a one-size-fits-all. Africa is unique. Africa is made up of 54 countries, each of them very different in terms of the lay of the land, in terms of the people, in terms of language, the political economy and the social economy. And so a one-size-fits-all solution would not work for the African continent. And I think it's important to take into consideration some of the very specific nuances that make Africa unique. One, from a multilingual perspective, more languages are spoken on the African continent than anywhere else in the world. Just Kenya, for example, has well over 45 languages. And of the major global languages, you'll find an Africa that speaks English, an Africa that speaks Portuguese, an Africa that speaks French, right? And so this is a very unique perspective from an African perspective, and I think DPI from an African perspective would need to look at some unique settings that are unique for African, and I can name a few. For one, connectivity. How many people have access to reliable internet connectivity on the African continent? And whether it's mobile or fixed or wireless, I think connectivity needs to be looked at as a premise of advancing DPI on the continent. And therefore, additional investments need to be made into the connectivity side of things, the internet connectivity side of things, so that DPI can add value to the lives of Africans on the continent. The second aspect that also needs to be taken into consideration, and a unique consideration for this continent, is access to reliable and affordable energy. Many African countries are actually energy deficient, especially when they go through droughts, when they go through periods of no rain, because a lot of our energy is actually generated via hydro, so the dams drop in terms of levels, and access to energy can be a problem. And even when energy is available, the cost of access to that energy can be a blocker for many Africans. For successful rollout and implementation of digital public infrastructure, populations need access to both reliable and affordable energy. And so that's also another unique consideration that needs to be taken into consideration when we're discussing the adoption of digital public infrastructure on the African continent. And I think Africa stands at a very unique crossroads, because additional investments can be made around access to clean energy. In countries such as Kenya, geothermal energy has showed amazing potential for providing not only clean but also affordable energy to millions of Kenyans. Access to wind energy and investments made in wind energy that can harness the wind to produce electricity, and also access to solar energy. How do we make additional investments around solar to ensure that people have access to clean and affordable energy? And so I think the access to internet connectivity, the access to reliable and affordable energy are two key considerations that need to be prioritized when working on DPI in Africa. I think Africa presents an amazing opportunity for the adoption of digital public infrastructure. As far as the youth dividend is concerned, no continent on earth has more young people than the continent of Africa, which means in the next 20 to 30 years, a larger percentage of of the working population, or people who are working age, a large percentage of consumers will actually be on the African continent. And this does present amazing opportunities, not only around digital public infrastructure, but also around economic growth. And these young people are smart, they are savvy, they are willing to learn. And I think this is another aspect that Africa can really leverage on in terms of its youth dividend to advance digital public infrastructure at global scale and at population scale on the African continent. And those are some of the unique considerations that I can speak about as far as some of the considerations that can be prioritized when working on DPI in Africa. Thank you.